Hello everyone, today we read and comment the 7th chapter of the 4th book of von Clausewitz Vom Kriege. Hitherto we have considered assistance arriving from the losing side as a mere increase of force. Therefore, as a reinforcement coming up directly from the rear, which is the most usual case. But the case is quite different if these fresh forces come upon the enemy in flank or rear. On the effect of flank or rear attacks, as so far as they belong to strategy, we shall speak in another place, such as one we have here in view, intended for the restoration of the combat, belongs chiefly to tactics, and is only mentioned because we are here speaking of tactical results. Our ideas therefore must trench upon the province of tactics. By directing a force against the enemy's flank and rear, its efficacy may be much intensified. But this is so far from being a necessary result, always that the efficacy may, on the other hand, be just as much weakened. The circumstances under which the combat has taken place decide upon this part of the plan as well as upon every other, without our being able to enter thereupon here. But at the same time, there are in it two things of importance for our subject. First, flank and rear attacks have, as a rule, a more favorable effect on the consequences of the decision than upon the decision itself. Now, as concerns the retrieving a battle, the first thing to be arrived at above all is a favorable decision and not magnitude of success. In this view, one would therefore think that a force which comes to re-establish our combat is of less assistance if it falls upon the enemy in flank and rear, therefore separated from us if it joins itself to us directly. Certainly cases are not wanting where it is so, but we must say that the majority are on the other side, and they are so on account of the second point, which is here important to us. The second point is the moral effect of the surprise, which, as a rule, a reinforcement coming up to re-establish a combat has generally in its favor. Now, the effect of a surprise is always heightened if it takes place in the flank or rear, and an enemy completely engaged in the crisis of victory in his extended and scattered order is less in a state to counteract it. Who does not feel that an attack in flank or rear, which at the commencement of battle, when the forces are concentrated and prepared for such an event, would be of little importance, gains quite another weight in the last moment of the combat? We must therefore at once admit that in most cases a reinforcement coming up on the flank or rear of the enemy will be more efficacious, will be like the same weight at the end of a longer lever, and therefore that under these circumstances we may undertake to restore the battle with the same force which employed in a direct attack would be quite insufficient. Here results almost defy calculation, because the moral forces gain completely the ascendancy. This is therefore the right field for boldness and daring. The eye must, therefore, be directed on all these objects. All these moments of cooperating forces must be taken into consideration when we have to decide in doubtful cases whether or not it is still possible to restore a combat which has taken an unfavorable turn. If the combat is to be regarded as not yet ended, then the new contest which is opened by the arrival of assistance fuses into the former. Therefore they flow together into one common result, and the first disadvantage vanishes completely out of the calculation. But this is not the case if the combat was already decided. Then there are two results separate from each other. Now, if the assistance which arrives is only of a relative strength, that is, if it is not itself alone a match for the enemy, then a favorable result is hardly to be expected from this second combat. But if it is so strong that it can undertake the second combat without regard to the first, then it may be able by a favorable issue to compensate or even overbalance the first combat, but never to make it disappear altogether from the account. At the Battle of Kunersdorf, August 12, 1759, Frederick the Great at the first onset carried the left of the Russian position and took 70 pieces of artillery, and at the end of the battle both were lost again, and the whole result of the first combat was wiped out of the account. Had it been possible to stop the first success and to put off the second part of the battle to the coming day, then if the king had lost it, the advantages of the first would have always been a set off to the second. But when a battle proceeding disadvantageously is arrested and turned before its conclusion, its minus result on our side not only disappears from the account, but also becomes the foundation of a greater victory. If, for instance, we picture to ourselves exactly the tactical course of the battle, we may easily see that until it is finally concluded, all successes in partial combats are only decisions in suspense, which by the capital decision may not only be destroyed, but changed into the opposite. The more our forces have suffered, the more the enemy will have expanded on his side. The greater, therefore, will be the crisis for the enemy, and the more the superiority of our fresh troops will tell. If now the total result turns in our favor, if we wrest from the enemy the field of battle and recover all the trophies again, then all the forces which he has sacrificed in obtaining them become sheer gain for us, and our former defeat becomes a stepping stone to a greater triumph. The most brilliant feats which with victory the enemy would have so highly prized that the loss of forces which the cost would have been disregarded leave nothing now behind but the regret at the sacrifice entailed. Such is the alteration which the magic of victory and the curse of defeat produces in the specific weight of the same elements. Therefore, if we are already decided in strength, decidedly superior in strength, and are able to repay the enemy his victory by a greater still, it is always better to forestall the conclusion of a disadvantageous combat if it is of proportionate importance, so as to turn its course rather than to deliver a second battle. Field Marshal Daun attempted in the year 1760 to come to the assistance of General Laudon at Liegnitz, whilst the battle lasted. But when he failed, he did not attack the king next day, although he did not want for means to do so. For these reasons, serious combats of advantage guards which precede battle are to be looked upon only as necessary evils, and when not necessary they are to be avoided. We have still another conclusion to examine. If on a regular pitched battle the decision has gone against one, this does not constitute a motive for determining on a new one. The determination for this new one must proceed from other relations. This conclusion, however, is opposed by a moral force which we must take into account. It is the feeling of rage and revenge. From the oldest field marshal to the youngest drummer boy, this feeling is general, and therefore troops are never in better spirits for fighting than when they have to wipe out a stain. This is, however, only on the supposition that the beaten portion is not too great in proportion to the wall, because otherwise the above feeling is lost in that of powerlessness. There is therefore a very natural tendency to use this moral force to repair the disaster on the spot, and on that account chiefly to seek another battle if other circumstances permit. It then lies in the nature of the case that this second battle must be an offensive one. In the catalogue of battles of second-rate importance, there are many examples to be found of such retaliatory battles, but great battles have generally too many other determining causes to be brought by this weaker motive. Such a feeling must undoubtedly have led the noble Blücher with this third corps to the field of battle on February the 14th, 1814, when the other two had been beaten 3 days before Montmirail. Had he known that he would have come upon Bonaparte in person, then naturally preponderating reasons would have determined him to put off his revenge to another day. But he hoped to revenge himself on Marmont, and instead of gaining the reward of his desire for honorable satisfaction, he suffered the penalty of his erroneous calculation. On the duration of the combat and the moment of its decision depend the distances from each other at which those masses should be placed which are intended to fight in conjunction with each other. This disposition would be a tactical arrangement insofar as it relates to one and the same battle. It can, however, only be regarded as such, provided the position of the troops is so compact that two separate combats cannot be imagined, and consequently that the space which the wall occupies can be regarded strategically as a mere point. But in war, cases frequently occur which those forces intended to fight in unison must be so far separated from each other that while their union for one common combat certainly remains, the principal object, still the occurrence of separate combats, remains possible. Such a disposition is therefore strategic. Dispositions of this kind are marches in separate masses and columns, the formation of advance guards and flanking columns, and also the grouping of reserves intended to serve as supports for more than one strategic point, the concentration of several corps from widely extended cantonments, etc., etc. We can see that necessity for these arrangements may constantly arise, and may consider them something like the small change in the strategic economy, whilst the capital battles and all that rank with them are the gold and silver pieces. So this is the second part of the chapter we began last time. It's pretty long, but pretty interesting. As you have heard, von Clausewitz is describing the importance of flank and rear attacks from a tactical point of view, as he points out, naturally, framing the tactical meaning within the broader strategical one, and explaining essentially a number of aspects, principally why flank and rear attacks are tactically so important, how we should regard them in terms of the outcome of decision of the battle proper, as reserves in practice, and naturally also considering the force that are spent during the combat, and also how the outcome, right, of a battle, in case of especially of success, if you take taken from our own side, can be exploited. How should we consider properly the results of combat from a tactical point of view, in terms of, for example, renewing another struggle, whether this can, let's say, be convenient or not. How we should consider the effects of these interactions of new reinforcements arriving on the battle, priority or less fundamentally to our capability to put up another fight. And this is naturally intertwined also with the previous, with the first topic of the flank and rear attack, because objectively, von Clausewitz in synthesis is telling us, look, that even important tactical victories can be overthrown because of the arrival, naturally, of fresh forces on the battlefield, especially from the rear. Think about Waterloo in general, and this should be considered, especially in terms of not just what the final outcome of this will be overall, but also, in fact, in terms of what you have already gained, and therefore what can you expect to do in these terms to, of course, minimize the damage, to put the damage to a minimum, in a sense. If you're defending, if you're attacking, otherwise. But even in here, properly, you may want to attack for reasons that, such as retaliation, revenge, things like these. But you should think of, wait a second, how and should I do that, and why? And also observing the difference that naturally exists in terms of scale of combats, how essentially these lesser reasons are way less frequent in larger engagements than in smaller ones. But anyhow, von Clausewitz says, either two, we have considered assistance arriving for the losing side as a mere increase of force, therefore as a reinforcement coming up directly from the rear, which is the most usual case. But the case is quite different if the fresh forces come upon the enemy in flank or rear, right? Because in the previous part of the chapter, we observed fundamentally how these relations work when you get reinforcements, normally from your own side of the battlefield. So basically, in a way, you could employ them as reserves. From a tactical point of view, all the importance in timing in this regard. But what about reinforcements that arrive from another direction of the battlefield, and more specifically, rear flank or rear or of the enemy, right? So he says, on the effect of flank or rear attacks, so far as they belong to strategy, we shall speak in another place, right? So strategically speaking, this will be seen elsewhere. Here it says, such as a one as we have here in view, intended for the restoration of the combat, right? Belongs chiefly to tactics. So this is mostly a tactical problem. It is only mentioned because we are here speaking of tactical results. Our ideas, therefore, must trench upon the province of tactics. This is the dimension that, except the very end of the chapter, von Clausewitz takes into consideration here. And he writes then, by directing a force against the enemy's flank and rear, its efficacy may be much intensified. Right, this is very important, and now he shows why. But this is so far from being a necessary result, always, that the efficacy may, on the other hand, be just as much weakened. Right, the circumstances under which the combat has taken place decide upon this part of the plan as well upon every other, without our being able to enter thereupon here. We have seen already in previous chapter, to make the long story short, how of course you can make arrive reinforcement from literally everywhere, but there is properly a moment, a ratio of strengths, properly, a balance in the scale for which doesn't matter how many troops you can send in, that engagement is over, right? And you maybe put up another one, but it's still something different. And properly, there's a moment at which a battle cannot be saved anymore. Or, of course, there are middle grounds in this regard, but there is probably a moment in which you should be understanding what's more or less convenient in these terms, right? Clausewitz then goes on and says, but at the same time, there are in it two things of importance for our subject. Now, first one, he says, flank and rear attacks have, as a rule, a more favorable effect on the consequences of the decision of combat than upon the decision itself, right? Now, this is particularly important because von Clausewitz, as we'll see now, highlights mostly how important it's for these things to happen in the first place when the situation is still critical, where in many ways the balance is still not been shifted yet, right? This is not much to do with eventually what you will be capable of doing afterwards, but it's mostly about the criticality of this movement for the decision of combat that matters, right? Von Clausewitz says, now, as concerns the retrieving a battle, the first thing to be arrived at above all is a favorable decision and not magnitude of success, right? This is very important. When you're fighting a battle, you're not much thinking in terms of, how much you can pursue and destroy, as we've seen in previous chapters, which is properly, after combat, right? So combat is not the most destructive moment, but a pursuit, but properly of winning the engagement, of winning the combat itself, right? So everything in that sense before the battle is decided is about deciding it, right? So it's about properly the tactics of it, of winning the enemy, which means at your disposal to revert to turn the outcome in your own favor. Von Clausewitz writes, in this view, one would therefore think that a force which comes to re-establish our combat is of less assistance if it falls upon the enemy in flank and rear, therefore separated from us, than if it joins itself to us directly. Certainly cases are not wanting where it is so, but we must say that the majority are on the other side, and that they are so on account of this second point, which is here important to us, right? So he's saying most of the times flank and rear attacks are actually more effective than if we receive the same amount of reinforcement from our own rear as reserves. Why? For the second reason, that is, says the second point is the moral effect of the surprise, which, as a rule, our reinforcement coming up to re-establish a combat has generally in its favor, right? So surprise, moral effect of it, right? It's not much about the moral material forces of the reinforcements that obviously play an important part, but it's probably how much you mess up the enemy plan in many ways and how the enemy reacts at that point. And naturally, if you appear from a side of the battlefield which the enemy didn't expect you to come out, well, that is messing up the thing, because naturally tactics has all its own logic. There is a line of combat. You can have reserves in that regard, but still we have seen, especially in the greater combats, it's very important actually, of course, to have reserves, but also to commit properly the majority of your forces towards the main threat, right? In other words, the larger combat is, the more is like an iron arm, right, of brute force rather than tactical sophistication. So this means that we could digress interestingly in some battles that we'll have to analyze at some point, thinking of the importance, for example, in fact, of flank attacks in some of the largest battles and how important they are, how sometimes the military logic brings them to occur in the first place, right? This is also very important historically speaking, because sometimes we wonder whether this was like done every once in a while or not. Actually, there are very interesting interpretations. I'm personally very passionate about this topic of flank attacks. I studied them by the 13th and 14th century. I'm writing something right now about them, and there is a lot of people telling the story of the battle from a chronically point of view, just even historically, and not caring about the military logic of it, and saying, here the flank attack, who knows, who doesn't, right? But there is a military logic there. You can't enforce saying, look, if it's, this was to happen, it's more likely to have occurred in here than in another engagement, right? And here's the reason why. So the whole aspect is actually thoroughly fascinating. We'll have to take into consideration at some point. And for Clausewitz explains the reason of this moral effect, flank and rear attacks, says now the effect of a surprise is always heightened if it takes place in the flank or rear, and an enemy completely engaged in the crisis of victory in his extended and scattered order is less in a state to counteract it. Who does not feel that an attack in flank or rear, which at the commencement of the battle, when the forces are concentrated and prepared for such an event, would be of little importance, gains quite another weight in the last moment of the combat. Ask Napoleon at Waterloo, right? Just for saying what he thought about those Prussians were coming from his right flank, almost rear. There is you understand here what the point is, that, and I could tell you once again with multiple examples. Take the Battle of Tagliacozzo 1268 or Machfeld 1278, were some of the most important European battles, actually possibly the most important European battles of the time. That's exactly it, right? It's the critical moment of the battle. Actually, not. The first one is when engagement was partially over. But I admit I haven't studied the sources. Instead, about the Battle of Machfeld, I have wrote an entire master thesis. So, in that case, for example, and I can't think of lots of other battles in which this happened, and objectively, it's exactly that moment. It's in the critical moment of combat that the flank attack is carried out, right? For this most obvious reason, that's the moment in which you have all the, where the balance, right? You have all the forces concentrated, and you have therefore the very last balance that will decide the battle still, to be decided, to be changed, to be shifted. So that's actually extremely important for whatever you will have to, if you ever study those battles in the 13th, 14th century. Just keep an eye on that. I can't. I can't say for other battles that I studied. Actually, the more, even in here, it's a matter of scale. It's a matter of possibilities, but we will see maybe in other battles as well. Just for in that specific context, it was very common to happen, right? In von Clausewitz's time, the thing was connected, Napoleonic warfare, mostly with the properly, making troops arrive on the battlefield, right? Not much of a concealed force that pops out at the decisive moment, but properly, looking at clock in hand, how much time does it take for those troops to march, etc. That's to get to the field. That's what Wellington was thinking about. Where the hell is Blücher at that point? And that's how the thing was done. And naturally, there is even in there properly a component of surprise and of talent. Therefore, it's not just about marching the directions, but it's also a matter of communication, of unity of command, and so on. Then von Clausewitz writes, we must therefore at once admit that in most cases a reinforcement coming up on the flank or rear of the enemy will be more efficacious, will be like the same weight at the end of a longer lever, and therefore that under these circumstances we may have undertake to restore the battle with the same force which employed in a direct attack would be quite insufficient. Here results almost defy calculation, because the moral forces gain completely the ascendancy, right? So here's beautiful physical metaphor. It says, it's as if you had the same force, but employed on two different parts of the lever, for example, right? So that's properly the difference. You have the same amount of troops, but the moral effect amplifies it. If it usually, not always, right? It's important. Von Clausewitz points out it's not true in absolute terms. There may be situations in which, if you actually receive reinforcement from your own rear, you could handle them better. You could, also coordinate better. There could be an advantage deriving from that. In absolute terms, for that, in relative terms for that battle to be victorious, that that would have not been the same if they had come in that same battle from flank or rear, right? But he says in most of the cases, actually, the one coming from flank or rear is the most effective one, chiefly for a moral effect, right? And it's interesting in this regard that you can see how, in fact, as von Clausewitz says, when it's moral forces that take over at that point. It's when the enemy army is disgregating. Therefore, it's properly, as we've seen in previous chapters, it's not about the destruction of the enemy that occurs chiefly during the pursuit, but it's properly about the psychological collapse of the enemy, right? That start seeing that things are turning the wrong turn, in fact, and that it cannot do much because of technicalities. As you were saying before, think about the line of combat, how units are organized, just for fighting essentially on just one frontally, let's say. Changing front, many people think it's kind of an easy thing. It's one actually of the most difficult things to do, especially in combat, and that's exactly why it happens, right? You can't be engaged in combat, and why are flank and rear attacks so successful? Because if you're engaged already against someone, you can't, disengage from the enemy and attack the other guy. Either you have reserves, right? Otherwise, you mess up the situation. You are actually going to lose more troops, possibly, and to facilitate the enemy in a way. And it's not that you, at that point, most of the times you have many options, let's say, and that's why von Clausewitz says here it's when you start crumbling, but at least you don't do it starting by yourself, right? By disengaging from a combat from which that will make you take losses in the same way, and during the time you're maneuvering, you will be crushed anyway by the same guy that pressed the zone. So it's actually very complicated. And if you really want to counter these things, it's normally through the use of reserves, right? And or other concealed parties that you may have, hidden for the same purpose, but even in there it's complicated. And it's important to notice that it's even a small force that can mess up the order of the array of the deployment. As you have outlined it, as we have seen. Now, units specifically are designed to fight just one front, right? So it's not even a matter of of sheer material forces. We've seen it's mostly about the fact, what the hell do we do now, right? It's about the sheer confusion, the and it's very important. Von Clausewitz says this is therefore the right field for boldness and daring, because paradoxically, it's what flank and rear attacks can, as we've just said, can be carried out with a very small amount of troops, even against very big armies, right? So the question is how, it's obviously something difficult to do, right? It takes a lot of competence, of expertise. You have to spot the right moment. There are always many reasons for which you may not be actually even certain whether this thing will succeed or not, or if the engagement maybe is already lost, right? Timing is also extremely important in these regards, but definitely the amount of courage and daring required in this regard is high, but it repays proportionally, because it's really with that's the moment in which you have to employ it, if you have it, right? Which is usually the case. There's always someone who is able doing it, and you can gain the greatest effects just from that, right? It's extremely important. And von Clausewitz here speaks of the eye, the coup d'œil, right? Says the eye must therefore be directed on all these objects. All these moments of operating forces must be taken into consideration when we have to decide in doubtful cases whether or not it is still possible to restore a combat which has taken an unfavorable turn, right? This is what von Clausewitz has said actually in the first part of the chapter, and also in previous ones, about the timing, about how this is actually a very complicated thing to do, right? It takes a great command actually to carry out a tactical masterpiece. An attack from the rear or flank is not an easy thing to carry out in terms of just where do I allocate these troops, right? When will they able to enter in combat, right? Will they understand where's the right moment, or will they succumb to anxiety or things like these, or will the enemy discover them first, or what will ever happen during in the front line in the first place? It may be actually more important, right? Here we're just essentially stressing the fact that the flank and rear attack usually on average has a much higher gives a much higher advantage than simply reinforcements coming from somewhere else. Von Clausewitz says, if the combat is to be regarded as not yet ended, then the new contest which is opened by the arrival of assistance fuses into the former. Right, so we have seen that this is basically when the fight is not over yet. So properly the reinforcements intervene in the moment you are still able to spend them for getting that fight done, right, and not starting another one practically. So Foucault says, therefore they flow together into one common result, right? And the first disadvantage vanishes completely out of the calculation, right? We have spoken of tactical units, right? Even of the single duels that overall bring to this greater result. And that are to be conceived for in this sense as let's say part of a single wave, right? There is this broader impetus that, in many ways, exactly because of a question of moral forces, is greater than the actual destruction that is waged during the combat itself. And this is the moment in which this tactical, let's say, successes in the same engagement add up and bring to one common result, as von Clausewitz puts it. So there is properly, even in here, a series of circumstances for which, during the first fight, you may even have lost, right, some important parts of your army, right? If you, just for my medieval examples, if you think about how those armies fought usually in the 13th, 14th century, was this deployment in depth with various ranks. It was usually two or three usually major battles, and it may as well be that the first rank was wiped out, right? Even the second one, right? Especially the Battle of Markfeld, right? Up to the last third rank, the combat was actually actually was not lost because it's complicated. The area we'll talk about the Battle of Markfeld, but just for saying that the other forces had been knocked out of the field, so it was literally about the last rank. That's where the flank attack came, right? And it doesn't matter that another rank, for example, had been wiped out, and then another one had left the field for pursuing the enemy. Another enemy rank had been broken. Up to that point, the battle could be won or lost, and it's incidentally a flank attack that decides it, right? So, and it can go in another way. Von Clausewitz says, but this is not the case if the combat was already decided, right? Or better, this is different, right? This is not just about who wins or who loses during the engagement, or probably whether the engagement was over, as we've seen in previous videos. And in that case, you can't properly revive it. Therefore, you can naturally re-engage the enemy, but at that point, it's two tactical results, says Von Clausewitz here. Then there are two results separate from each other, right? So it's two different tactical engagements that have been decided at that point, not tactically but strategically, right? Because you decided at some point to re-attack the enemy in a way, or properly, to simply attack him if you are simply the reinforcement that arrived from somewhere else that had not fought yet, right? Von Clausewitz says, now, if the assistance which arrives is only of a relative strength, that is, if it is not in itself alone a match for the enemy, then a favorable result is hardly to be expected from this second combat. Right, but if it is so strong that it can undertake the second combat without regard to the first, then it may be able by a favorable issue to compensate or even overbalance the first combat, but never to make it disappear altogether from the account. What is Von Clausewitz meaning here? That of course there is things can go in many different directions, right? And you can't really have a reinforcement, doesn't matter when, but it arrives and is able to overturn the outcome of the battle. The problem though is that the destruction that has been waged at some point cannot be cancelled, right? There are certain energies that are spent that you can't relight up at that point. There are properly losses that cannot be recovered anymore. Not just in a strategic context with new troops and so on. So for that tactical engagement, there are certain things that, of course, from the beginning of the battle, change in a irreversible way. Von Clausewitz makes an example of how chiefly time in the Battle of Kunersdorf, August 12, 1759, shows the case. It says, at the Battle of Kunersdorf, Frederick the Great at the first onset carried the left of the Russian position and took 70 pieces of artillery, which is a freaking lot. At the end of the battle, both were lost again. And the whole result of the first combat was wiped out of the account. Had it been possible to stop the first success and to put off the second part of the battle to the coming day, then even the king had lost it. The advantages of the first would have always been a set off to the second. So in here, the example shows how we were saying how a day difference may have still not the suspension of the combat may still have not changed the outcome formally, but still the time that brought to the separation of these two engagements, in fact, could have brought actually big results, big advantages to the side that even losing the next day would have still secured a lot of enemy, but may have even, slaughtered the prisoners. But this is just an example to tell you how, there is more time to organize, to do something better of the whole thing, and to even secure certain result. Doesn't matter if you lose the next day, right? This is particularly important, and it naturally has a very practical observation, as most of the Vom Kriege, Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, but when a battle proceeding disadvantageously is arrested and turned before its conclusion, its minus result on our side not only disappears from the account, but also becomes the foundation of a greater victory. Right? If, for instance, we picture to ourselves exactly the tactical course of the battle, we may easily see that until it is finally concluded, all successes in partial combats are only decisions in suspense, right? Which, by the capital decision, may not only be destroyed, but change into the opposite. The Battle of Markfeld, the example we were making before about the third Habsburgic line, is exactly it, right? It says, the more our forces have suffered, the more the enemy will have expanded on his side, the greater, therefore, we're talking obviously in relative terms, the greater, therefore, will be the crisis for the enemy, and the more the superiority of our fresh troops will tell. Right? This is very important. It's still relative, because it doesn't say, this is always the case, right? In a case, but in absolute terms, it is true that, of course, the more our forces are wiped out, the more the enemy has spent his own energies, his own forces in turn, to wipe them out, right? So that's, as we've seen, tactically speaking, we've seen the dramatic, in previous videos, the dramatic importance of fresh troops in this sense, right? You may have still lots of troops intact if they're tired, right? It doesn't take even just to have fought, right? Sometimes it's just, they haven't slept, right? This is crucial, right? Well, still the fresh troops have a great advantage. May not be decisive, but it's still very, very important. So, von Clausewitz says, if now the total result turns in our favor, if we wrest from the enemy the field of battle and recover all the trophies again, then all the forces which he has sacrificed in obtaining them become sheer gain for us, and our former defeat becomes a stepping stone to a greater triumph. You understand what the point is here, really, and why it is important also that the critical moment really gets to a point where all the forces are spent, because for all the forces are usually, the greater the engagement is, as we have seen, the more forces are spent. So it's not just about, in the result, we don't just have to take into account for example, the enemy casualties during combat that we've seen are not probably the least important thing. And not just the most overwhelming amount of trophies we have seen here namely, things like prisoners or artillery during the pursuit. Right, that also happens, partially speaking, in certain parts of the battle, not necessarily at the very end. Right, there is always some unit that is pursued for when it's broken at the moment. Generally, not always in such a relevant measure, but still important. And this can be observed. In fact, the greater the engagements are, right, so that it's as if there are different parts of battle that are large enough to see that this different things happening, but properly also there is this other important element, that is the effort that the enemy has made psychophysically to just keep on fighting or just to stay on the field. And that is something that if we win the encounter, right, and especially the more the combat has progressed, so the more those sources are being spent, the more we should consider those forces essentially spent from the enemy side as our own gain, because at the end of the day, what we have spent, what the enemy has spent, will sum up as the, in balance, as the difference also between the, an actually an actual success from a tactical point of view, and instead of defeat. Right, as we have seen, there can be a battle in which the enemy loses so much he has not even achieved the strategic object of the tactical engagement. Right, so that's very important as well. So the more this happens, the more the situation is reversed at the end of the battle, or decided anyway at the end of the battle. But probably also considering how much we have lost for the enemy to have spent for it, right? And the more our victory will be, in many ways, not necessarily crashing all the time. It's still something that has wiped out most of the enemy forces. It's quite important. For Clausewitz writes, the most brilliant feats which with victory the enemy would have so highly prized that the loss of forces which they cost would have been disregarded, leave nothing now behind but regret at the sacrifice entailed, right? Because if you fight, it's because up to the very end you hope to make it anyway. And until you don't make it, you can't give up, because you will not make it anyway. So that's why those resources are so important, right? And why battles and wars are so bitter in this regard, because there's probably an enormous loss, right? That cannot be just said, okay, it was a card game, you can't start it over again. No, there are entire political and social systems that lose everything for fighting to the very end, for which they hope something is going to happen, right? Not necessarily winning the war, but winning it, for example, at certain conditions, or losing exactly at certain conditions. Right? And this plays all along, right? For Clausewitz says, such is the alteration with which the magic of victory and the curse of defeat produces in the specific weight of the same elements. And this is obvious why, because it's mostly a moral matter, right? This is probably not even about the losses, material losses in absolute terms, but how much you are able to destroy the enemy psychologically, the point he will not fight anymore, will give up the fight, right? And naturally for doing that, it's because he has spent his own forces. This is really very important. Therefore, von Clausewitz says, even if we are decidedly superior in strength and are able to repay the enemy his victory by a greater still, it is always better to forestall the conclusion of a disadvantageous combat if it is of proportionate importance, so as to turn its course rather to deliver a second battle, right? So, in other words, don't try to get it done at the moment, right? Spend all the resources that you take if this is what is going to assure you that the outcome will the enemy will not have enough resources to be to eventually overthrow you once again in that engagement or in another, right? And this is also why sometimes you really don't have a choice, right? This is the logic of war, the way it goes, right? It's not a prescription proper. It's not what the Vom Kriege is doing in if not from a properly, disclosure in the sense, it is, just know this is what happens in practice and that you can't ignore it. And that's why you should actually commit yourself without to this task without too much problems, right? Too much excitations, let's say. Right? This is particularly important. It cannot be simply disregarded. So, for Clausewitz says, Field Marshal Daun attempted in the year 1760 to come to the assistance of General Loudon at Liegnitz whilst the battle lasted, but when he failed, he did not attack the king next day, although he did not want for means to do so. Which is a good example of someone who understands, okay, that engagement is over, there's not much to do. He consciously refused to spend his own forces against a victorious enemy, whilst the troops he intended to reinforce were wiped out. Von Clausewitz writes, for these reasons, serious combats of advance guards which precede a battle are to be looked upon only as necessary evils, and when not necessary, they are to be avoided. Right. So, sometimes this is very typical of Napoleonic wars in many ways, because the battlefields were sometimes very large, because chiefly the armies were so very large that, of course, engage. But this happens naturally in other epochs. But of course, the avant-gardes were often engaged, committed in clashes that before, the whole army realized what the hell was going on, took a while, and therefore at that point you had to disengage with certain losses, but at that point the commander should have decided whether, what was the consistency of the enemy forces, what the strength ratio was about fundamentally, and decide there what to do, right? Whether to engage or disengage. This is very important, but it is also to stress that, of course, the disadvantage could be so great that even if you have to sacrifice, some troops, well, that still may be better than what could happen if you send other reinforcements in that could be wiped out and make the thing worse. Clausewitz then says, we still have another conclusion to examine. And he writes, if on a regular pitched battle the decision has gone against one, this does not constitute a motive for determining on a new one. The determination for this new one must proceed from other relations. He is referring naturally to the to strategic relations as well, but naturally, he's referring to, should we pass to another fight? Should, like in the case of the avant-garde, should we, for example, the tactical thing has started, the engagement has commenced, right? But should we really push forward, right, or not, right? So this can happen even in a larger battle. That is to say, even, there are also battles that are fought at close distance, right? It can be considered as to separate things. Think about the Jena Auerstedt, or the von Clausewitz, naturally points out very often about, and but you may want to decide at that point whether it's necessary to push forward. If you have crushed your own enemy on the battlefield, if you still have enough strength, enough forces to be useful somewhere else, right? That's all a calculation, but must be taken into account. But generally speaking, von Clausewitz says this idea of taking a step forward once an engagement is over is, however, opposed by a moral force. Or better, the contrary. This decision of saying, okay, well, let's go one engagement by a time, is opposed by a moral force, which you must take into account. It is the feeling of rage and revenge, right? From the oldest field marshal to the youngest drummer boy, this feeling is general, and therefore troops are never in better spirits for fighting than when they have to wipe out a stain. This is, however, only on the supposition that the beaten portion is not too great in proportion to the wall, because otherwise the above feeling is lost in that powerlessness, right? There is a sense of course, managing after an engagement that has not been particularly positive to restart, to put up the fight once again, put the fight on once again, and yet this may actually be contrary to good reasons, and we shouldn't listen to rage and revenge in that regard, because it's very easy to send someone to, even after massive defeats, there are still units that, in spite of retreating, say, let us fight again, let us show the enemy that we are still capable of fighting. Yes, but they would have been wiped out, because altogether they would have not been sufficient to actually do anything but being defeated in turn. So this is not to say that, and it's interesting, for Clausewitz says it's a general feeling, right? Even the commander-in-chief feels that, right? But naturally he's the person that should understand for more coldly that whether that's convenient or not on a rational base, rather than just, writing this collective sense of retaliation, you could say. And von Clausewitz adds an important note to this. It says, in the catalogue of battles of second-rate importance, there are many examples to be found of such retaliatory battles, but great battles have generally too many other determining causes to be brought on by this weaker motive. That is to say, this motive of rage and retaliation could even sometimes be sufficient, especially in smaller combats, and there are lots of examples objectively, to reverse the tides, right? Especially when the fight is over, but you can't, with the same troops that have been defeated, to actually strike back. There are lots of examples of this. But the causes, given that the fight is over, are not to be considered tactical in this regard. They're tactically functional. I explain myself better. If the engagement has finished and you've been defeated, there is a reason. There is probably that strength ratio that has gone wrong for you, right? But you can regroup, reorder, deploy, and attack the enemy wherever it is. But at that point, as we've seen in the previous chapter, that's not the same engagement. The first engagement is over. Now the thing has passed to strategy once again, and therefore the reason for attacking once again is not tactical at that point, it's strategical, right? And once again, it's plenty of examples of troops that were defeated were able to strike back in another engagement shortly afterwards, right? Especially when the engagements were small, right? The broader battles, at that point, in fact, the logic for which you can win again is not tactical, it's strategical, right? If during the first engagement you had been told to strike back once again, you had made it, that would have been an engagement won. You would have not needed that. So the reason why it didn't happen is that properly, even if maybe you had fresh reserves or whatever, sending them in might have been actually a mistake because the enemy might have overwhelmed them. And the reason why, for example, you may be able to strike again is exactly as the enemy has not been able to destroy you totally for whichever reason, so that it wasn't naturally maybe such a crashing battle, but a crashing defeat for you. But when we talk about greater engagements, feelings like rage and retaliation are actually, ever more distant from the logics for which that same engagement happens, right? So that rage and retaliation, broadly meant, are a bit, present in every war, right? At every moment you really want to smash the enemy for whichever reason, right? And in this regard, that is part of the logic, but the causes, the strategic logic, for example, for which that engagement happens, is overwhelming over what you individually feel like, right? How many enormous battles have been fought, also historically speaking, by sides that had a lot of, interest for crushing an enemy. It's not that they hated him particularly more than maybe just even other troops that they were fighting alongside with. This is typical look at Middle Ages, when, especially not in national realities, was a certain homogeneity of intent and so on. But that's pretty even. But in larger battles, not only, first of all, the rage and the retaliation is, in relative terms, a much smaller motive, weaker motive proper for the battle itself, but properly it will be crushed overwhelmingly, considering the importance of the battle in itself. Of course, there can be a major battle that ends up in a draw, theoretically, but it's not so frequent, and generally speaking, even a smaller defeat will bog down the defeated in a much greater way, as we've seen in previous chapters, for reasons of moral impact than the smaller engagements can, right? It's as if there was this kind of bulky attritional factor that even when things do not really turn so dramatically badly in major tactical engagements, that can cause enormous losses. We've seen it many times. If you analyze, we've made the example a couple of videos ago about Manzikert, right? These big battles, take Mariokefel, and everybody thinks that they are tactical disasters just because, strategically speaking, it had this dramatic impact. But when you study the battle themselves, you realize, say, wait a second, but this wasn't even like a crushing defeat. Like, there was a part of the entire Imperial army came back to the camp, right? The thing went on, the Seljuks didn't press on the fullest, they didn't slaughter and everybody. The reason why that victory was so great for the Turks was for obvious political reasons. They captured the Roman Emperor. They generally speaking, that brought to whole set of circumstances that cannot be explained by the battle alone, and that are somewhat pre-existing. It's as if they were sleeping. They're to be activated in those cases. So this is very important in the Clausewitzian thought, because it makes you realize how all the time how you cannot look at military engagement without thinking, first of all, of the consequences of it, but more properly of what are the concrete connections that exist between the battlefield and everything around it, let's say even very far away. We could digress on this, and there is no need actually to, but this opens just to an enormous chapter. Think about, people believe that things like geopolitics exist, right? They think that you can minimize, a global analysis on the base of geography, right? Of even of countries, as if, countries were monads that acted automatically with any force within them without an enormous complexity and predictability, or lots of other, let's say, parasitical realities that operate within them, right? And this is the narrowing down to idiocy at some point of thoughts that here by Von Clausewitz are explained brilliantly, right? In all their intelligence, we could say. And there is a lot of this that really strikes me, because it really gets to the point of how important not even the military element really is when compared to when connected especially to the moral consequences of the same military action. That is, of course, it all starts from there, but at the same time, there is properly a matter of, like, humans are more discouraged psychologically than physically at the end of the day, which you may think otherwise. Instead, it is really not, right? There is properly a mental attitude that makes the thing done more than actually the physical effort that maybe derives from it, but it would be nothing if there was no dedication, no motivation to the cause. So this, as I was saying, there is no need now to start, my my usual rants, but let's say there is an enormous lot to learn from these ideas. Von Clausewitz makes another example, the one of Blücher being overwhelmed by Napoleon. It says, such a feeling must undoubtedly have led the noble Blücher with his Third Corps to the field of battle on February 14, 1814. This is the campaigns in France where Blücher was wiped out by, when the other two had been beaten 3 days before at Montmirail. He had known that he would have come, had he known, he says, that he would have come upon Bonaparte in person, then naturally preponderating reasons would have determined him to put off his revenge another day, but he hoped to revenge himself on Marmont, and instead of gaining the reward of his desire for honorable satisfaction, he suffered the penalty of his erroneous calculation, and he was overwhelmed. And that was a massive blow to the Allies in 1814. As just an example of, naturally, even the option that was probably a miscalculation, right? But it was it started from a trivial reason of retaliation, and you see how weak that was compared to the forces that eventually smashed him. So this is not just anecdotal. This is what you have to think when you study Von Clausewitz. Everything is written here is steel logic. Right, it's crystal logic. It's not that someone can come up to this work and say, according to me, it's not like that. Because if you do that, chances are you don't have not even read it. You don't know what it talks about. You don't know what it is, and you just want to quote it to act as if you had with such depth. No, this thing must be studied step by step. That's the only way you can actually understand the Vom Kriege, and unavoidably to give him right, because every single historical, military historical event, and not only that, correspond to what is saying here, right? Von Clausewitz says, on the duration of the combat and the moment of its decision depend the distances from each other at which those masses should be placed which are intended to fight in conjunction with each other, right? So here he talks about those elements that are properly strategical and have to do, if you want, even just with a preparation for the battle, and of course that's in fact in a nutshell what the all the strategies for where you have to fight, how, and this auxiliary means, in a way, that are those that eventually fall into this dimension of, troops that can't, they're basically revolving around the battle, whether they are on the field or not, but they can intervene and so on. Clausewitz says this disposition would be a tactical arrangement insofar as it relates to one and the same battle. It can, however, be so that theoretically these means should all converge to one combat, but even if in different phases of the same battle. However, it can only be regarded as such, provided the position of the troops is so compact that two separate combats cannot be imagined, right? And consequently, that the space which the wall occupies can be regarded strategically as a mere point, right? So that's the point. So that if they actually make it to the battle and they, that it's not that they're too distant, then the engagement ends without them, with them arriving later, right? This is not evidently the point. So it's a strategical matter at that point. And if Clausewitz says, but in war, cases frequently occur where even those forces intended to fight in unison must be so far separated from each other that while their union for one common combat certainly remains the principal object, still the occurrence of separate combats remains possible. Right? You can have all of these units at your disposal and say, okay, let's go fight the enemy there. Right? But in order to be secure, you want to scout, you want to even carry out one of those flank attacks and so on. There is always the risk that the plan doesn't go as you so you may engage with other enemy units along the way. That transforms to different tactical engagements that, as we have seen, cannot always be reconnected to a single one of the battle you were planning in that regard, and therefore form this other, dimension for which it doesn't matter if you thought them to originally that you could use them all together in one battle. It will not happen. So the connection that is formed here, as von Clausewitz says, such a disposition is therefore strategic. It is strategic, right? So it forms at that point all what still prepares or is connected with that battle, but mostly from a strategical point of view, and not necessarily because you will make it for those forces to participate in the combat and therefore in the tactical dimension of that single engagement. A tactical unit, we could call it, in terms of outcome of the combat. So von Clausewitz describes and says dispositions of this kind are marches in separate masses and columns, the formation of advance guards and flanking columns, also the grouping of reserves intended to serve as supports for more than one strategic point, the concentration of several corps from widely extended cantonments, etc., etc. So you realize even in here, troops drawn from everywhere, a great complexity, of course, of an army, of a military machine that needs all these elements to act, with this broader hierarchy, but also somewhat on their own. If anything, they're all autonomous with their cadres and officers and so on. So von Clausewitz says, we can see that the necessity for these arrangements may constantly arise and may consider them something like the small change in strategic economy, whilst the capital battles and all that rank with them are the gold and silver pieces. Right, so it's as if these were the smaller coins, the cents, right? Whereas the big battle is the golden, the gulden, right? And those that count really more. So I believe that there is a great deal of things to be drawn from this, let's say, properly strategic vision of how battles are to be taken, are in consideration in the first place, not even to be fought, but properly what can happen, what doesn't, whether they're useful in this economy of war, which probably this is a bargain, this is a negotiation, even with the enemy, just with harsher means, let's say, but it's always about that in the ultimate, meaning of war and how they start and they're fought in the first place. So once again, this is really very important to take into consideration. We will try to be we're just entering into the matter, right? So we are just approaching the most, let's say, even just operational sides of the story, Vom Kriege. This was, we finished this chapter. And next time we will observe the reciprocal intention of fighting, in fact, so that will focus more specifically on that bargain, right, and its meaning, generally speaking. So for now we stop here, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.